Anyway, well, thank you very much. Glad to be here in Hershey, Pennsylvania, because 45 years ago in Pennsylvania, something very extraordinary happened. That's what I'm going to talk about to you. If we see the next slide, this is George Plimpton. Maybe most of you know him. For those of you who don't know him, Mr. Plimpton was a writer. He was a journalist. He came from a very rich family, let's say it that way. Born in New York, he went to Harvard. Then he went to Cambridge University in England. So he was the editor of the Paris Review. Paris Review was a literature magazine about American contemporary literature. So all these things we're not supposed to talk about in the SIR meetings, but we will talk about George Plimpton because he's closely uh, linked to hockey history. If we show the next slide, it's not a very good picture, but then again, do we have a good picture with Ernest Hemingway? Maybe not, but we can see on the right George Plimpton and Ernest Hemingway. So they knew each other. It is said that once Ernest Hemingway said about George Plimpton to other people, he said, "Well, he's the real thing, he's the real deal. Watch that guy. He's gonna be a great writer." Well, he was a great writer, George Plimpton, but maybe not in the sense that Ernest Hemingway meant. If we show the next picture, what Mr. Plimpton did was it's called participatory journalism. Instead of just looking at a game or something and writing about it, well, be part of the game. Try it. Be a baseball player. Be a boxer. Be a golfer. And that's what George Plimpton did. And of course, you can see him with Willie Mays. You can see him with a boxer. I'm sorry, I forget. Is it Archie Moore? I think he was the champion at the time. So he boxed with him. He played golf, not very well, but still, and he, of course, wrote about his experiences. He wrote books about them. And if we go to the next image, of course, the most famous experience, journalistic experience, was when George Plimpton played for the Detroit Lions in a preseason game. And he wrote a book about that. And the book is called Paper Lion. And it's also they made a movie, maybe not a good one, but again, if somebody makes a movie about you, and I think it's not too bad. So yes, it looks great, but if you look at the bottom picture, if you go back, sorry, the bottom picture, that's quite accurate. It didn't go very well with the Detroit Lions being quarterback extremely precise. The smallest mistake and the play doesn't work. So it didn't go very well, but still he continued. And if we see the next slide, he played with the New York Philharmonic Orchestra with Leonard Bernstein. He played in a movie with John Wayne. He was a trapezist. So at the time, also in the late 60s, beginning of the 70s, George Plimpton had a TV show. Well, it wouldn't run all the time, but every month or 2 months, he had a TV special on ABC. So things were going well for George Plimpton in those days. Was making a lot of money, but of course he put all his money in the Paris Review. So in the end, maybe he did all this for the American literature, but still he was a very known person. Everybody knew, well, not everybody, but in the newspapers in those days there was no social media, but a lot of people knew about George Plimpton. So if we go to the next slide, so in 77, so I guess nobody was surprised when it was announced that George Plimpton would drive a race car in Watkins Glen, New York, and also he was going to be a goalie in the NHL. So I say that, like it was nothing, but for George Plimpton, maybe it was nothing. For all of us, of course, it's unbelievable to play in the National Hockey League game. But it was George. It was his work. And at first, he was supposed to play in a game against Montreal. So the game would have been in Montreal, but for some reason, the Montreal Canadiens didn't want to be associated with this experiment. So finally, it was decided that George will play with the Bruins against the Flyers in Philadelphia on October 6, 1977. Next slide, please. So it made quite a few headlines, of course, especially the Boston region, but also it began, to spread around the country that George Plimpton will ruin the Bruins, like they said in those days. And it's interesting because that year there was a lot of goalies with the Boston Bruins. You had Jerry Cheevers, of course, Gilles Gilbert. There was Ron Graham that was coming from the WHA. Also Jim Petty, nickname is Seaweed. And you saw the fellow yesterday, Dave Parrow, who played with Hershey later on, but he was at the Bruins training camp. So with George, that's 6 goalies at the training camp. So next image. So you can see at the left George Plimpton with Jerry Cheever's jersey, talking with Don Cherry, and then again George skating with Jim Petty. So he talked a lot with Petty. Petty explained him the rules of goaltending to be in the goaltenders union and stuff like that. So he learned a lot from Jim Petty. Next slide. It's a close-up because it's a very strange helmet and mask combination that he was wearing. In those days, there were very, very few goalies who had a cage, wearing a cage. You only had maybe Gilles Gratton, who tried it with the Rangers, and maybe in the WHA you had the Richard Brodeur and Dave Tatterin, I think. So almost all the goalies had a real fiberglass mask. In fact, George, he bought one in the store in New York, but it was not good enough to be used. So they found this Northland helmet and they put this Jofa cage on it. So it's a very, very strange combination. I think he's the only goalie in the history of hockey to wear this combination. Anyway, so if we go to the next picture, so you can see him practicing or trying to, because he was not a good skater. George was not a good skater. He was fearless, maybe, but not a good skater. So it was tough. You see John Wensink to the right. And next picture, then that's when, the big machine came in. And the articles, they were published in dozens and maybe hundreds of newspapers around the country in every state. It's quite unbelievable to see how much coverage that George Plimpton got from experience. So that's where they call him the paper Bruin, because he was, of course, the paper lion before. So, well, the articles are not very nice to him. They say that he has a lot of problems and it's going to be a tough game against the Flyers. But anyway, his experiment is going on. If we go to the next picture, what's so mind-boggling, at the same time as he's preparing to be a goalie, he's also preparing to be a race driver. So, I mean, who does that, preparing to be a goalie and preparing to be a race driver at the same time? So he did go to Watkins Glen, was not the best racer, but like they say, among these competitors will be George Plimpton, who seemingly has done everything else, but he will be making his debut as a race car driver. I'm not sure if it was really his debut. I think he was in other races, but maybe on a closed circuit, it was his first experience. Anyway, so we have a picture of George at Watkins Glen. So it was just 3 days, I think, or 4 days before his famous game against the Flyers. Next slide, we can see him before the game, getting his equipment on. I think it's Frosty, the trainer for the Mr. Forstall, I think, for the Bruins. So they say it's scared stiff. Maybe he's not scared, but he was very maybe worried about what was going to happen against the Flyers. So it was a 5-minute game before the preseason game. So it was never official or any kind. There's no official stats of this game that George played in. It was just a 5-minute game before. So I think there's something on the screen. Anyway, so can we go to the next presentation? Not presentation, sorry, next slide. So there's a train also. So that's George coming out of the tunnel into the spectrum, a great experience. He wrote, of course, a lot better than about it than when I'm telling you. Next slide. So he's talking a little bit with Don Cherry, and also we can see Ron Graham along the boards at the spectrum before the game. And we almost lost the picture. If we go to the next slide, just a little recall. When he played with the Lions, he had number 0, and with the Bruins, he had 00. So I made my old Boston Bruins jersey personalized to George. But then again, there's always something wrong. If you go to the previous image, you're going to see that the little Bruin on the shoulder is missing. So his jersey was kind of I don't know, they made it especially for him, so they forgot to put the little Bruins on the shoulder, so my replica is not accurate. Well, it's there, it's just that we don't see it on the picture, but the other players, they have it. So you can see, you're going to see them on the pictures. Well, I hope. If not, I will apologize for my mistake. So not the next, but the next picture, and then the one after that. So yeah, you can see the little Bruins on the shoulders of the defensemen. So why? Okay, so maybe we can go to the next slide. Okay, so it doesn't begin very good. The first minute or two, they spend it on the Flyers' end of the rink, so it's okay. But the first shot goes in, so it was a deflection. So to be honest with Plimpton, it was almost impossible to stop. But still, it's a goal on the first shot, and you know how it is for the goalies. It's very tough mentally, even for George. So next picture. Actually, it's a composite of many pictures. You can see George in action with his, how can we say it, unorthodox style. And I think we lost the presentation. Don't worry, we'll be there. We'll be back soon. So yes, he didn't have a lot of time, of course, to prepare to be a goalie. Those things take time, of course, to become a goalie. It takes months, years of hard work. So George had only a few weeks, but still he was playing. And if we see the next slide, maybe we won't see it here, but people who are at home, they will see the picture. People are laughing in the stands. Most of them are laughing because you can really see that the goalie is way behind. He's many seconds behind the action. So still, people laugh, but in the end, George had the last laugh because next picture, somehow he made 6 or 7 saves. There was also one goal post, or maybe 2, we don't know. But he did very good for a goalie with almost no experience. And he stopped Reggie Leach's penalty shot. Everybody knew there was going to be a penalty shot. Everybody said, well, I'm sure there's going to be a penalty shot. And of course, Mike Milbury threw his stick, or someone else. And there was Reggie Leach, big star for the Flyers. Yes, Jerry Chavers told Reggie Leach not to make a slap shot, but still he made a shot. He shot on George, and George made the save. Acrobatically, he just went very far from his net, and he just slided in front of Reggie Leach, and the puck hit his skate. So great save. And next slide. After making his save, George was, of course, congratulated by all his teammates. So what happens after that? Next slide. George goes under the stands. He answers the questions of journalists and stuff like that. Meanwhile, there's a huge brawl between the Bruins and the Flyers. Hundreds and hundreds of minutes of penalties. There's also a fight under the stands between a few Flyers and Bruins players. The reason, well, if there has to be a reason, is that the game before there was a cheap shot from Terry O'Reilly to one of the Flyers players. So that's retaliation that we're seeing now. So finally, George missed everything. We're gonna see the next slide. Of course, it's all in the newspapers in the following days. In those days, it took maybe 3 days before the people got the information, but they got it. So the Plimpton survives the Flyers. Plimpton is another parent. Plimpton shines for in nets for the Bruins. But Plimpton's finds hockey no fun. So yes, it was a tough experience for him, but still it was filmed. So there are films from that game. They're not on YouTube, sorry, but if you buy the DVD about Plimpton, it's called Plimpton with exclamation point. There are a few scenes from the game, so it really happened. And if we go to the next slide, yes, there's the thing about the Plimpton misses a brawl and Plimpton sees brawl. So obviously, one of the people who chose the text, the title, was not aware that Plimpton was not on the ice. And even if he was on the ice, the Bruins had two other goalies, so I'm pretty sure Plimpton would not have been allowed to go on the ice to fight the other players. So yes, players are serious in spite of Plimpton. That's done very nice for Plimpton, but anyway, so it was a success. There was no maybe TV special for that occasion, but still it was all in the can, and of course he wrote about it. Next slide. There were articles in Sports Illustrated and other places, and in French also. I saw this article in Sélection du Reader's Digest. I saw it when I was maybe 6 or 7 years old, so it touched me to the point that I became a goalie. Maybe not because only of George, but still I read that article dozens and dozens of times. Next slide. Of course, in the following years, Plimpton maybe he didn't star in other sports, but he did make a lot of advertisements for in television, showing that in television games were better than Atari games, and that's in that case that's pretty obvious. Next slide, please. So in '85, that's maybe George's most famous article, The Curious Case of Sid Finch, a young pitcher that came from nowhere. He was a yoga also. He did yoga. He wasn't sure if he was really going to be a pitcher. There are things more important in life than being pitcher. But still, he went to the Mets training camp and he had a 140-mile-per-hour fastball. Nobody heard about him, and there's a good reason for that. The date of publication of the article is April 1st, 1985. So it was all a hoax. It was a hoax, but still, he made a book about that also. Speaking of books, next slide. Finally in '85, the book Open Net was published. So it's mainly about George's experiment as a goalie for the Bruins, but also it's a book about hockey in general. Lots of stories about Gilles Gratton, lots of stories about Eddie Shore, players' wives, and also at the end, he went to Edmonton, he met Wayne Gretzky and stuff like that. So quite an interesting book about hockey. And it's been republished in many covers, and they seem to be uglier and uglier each time. The last cover is stupid because it's not even showing a goalie. So I mean, who chose that picture? I don't know. So that's about it. I think next slide. No, just to say a few words about George. He stayed a Boston Bruin fan. Well, he was a player, so I mean, technically he stayed with the Bruins, even when he went to the Madison Square Garden, because he lived in New York, of course. When he went to the Garden, he had this Bruins pennant, but maybe he didn't take it to the blues, the blue seats, but he did have his Bruins pennant when he was sitting in his lodge or his front row seats, of course. So I think that's about it now. I know that there are one more slide, As any important person, well, George was in The Simpsons. So where he was playing his usual role of somebody who knows about everything, about everything, with his kind of a English accent, but not really English. And well, like they said, there was a book about him when he died. The book is called George Being George. So he was really someone else. And next slide and last slide. He was also the commissioner for fireworks in New York. If you don't know that, he was very fond about fireworks. So what a great, well, I think we can say he was a great man. Maybe not a great goalie, but he was certainly a great man. He died in 2003, but we still think about him. Thank you very much.